I hit that now. And we will post it on our blog. For folks that also need any closed captioning or live transcripts, you should be able to see that at the bottom of your screen there. And that should be available to you. I'm going to throw a link in the chat. This is just a post survey that we're hoping you will fill out. We'll throw it into the chat as we get a little bit closer to the end as well, but this is just going to help us understand how we can make this better for folks and how we can support you in this work. Jude, I might just let you share a little bit about your goals for getting this over. I see an email coming through of somebody that needs the Zoom link, so I'm going to try to get that to somebody real quick.
Sure thing. So thank you everyone for joining us today. The purpose of this training and kind of why Jody and I came together is, well, one, we're both members of the Voter Education Fund cohort with King County elections. And so we're tasked with doing as nonprofits with doing nonpartisan voter education and outreach. And one place where we definitely saw our goals and organizations align is a need to help folks integrate conversations about voting into day-to-day work activities. Voting's kind of one of those things where it can fall to the wayside. It can seem not important. It could seem not useful, especially in contexts where you're talking about voting with folks that have a lot of other life circumstances going on. So what we hope to get out of this is that y'all will have an opportunity to also, discuss and bounce ideas after viewing our presentation about ways that we can make voting part of our regular everyday conversations. And then also just strategies to go about it and make sure that those conversations that we're having are with context and are informed by the background of those we serve and those we work with, because we never want this to be a burdensome or harmful conversation. Voting is about healing and community connections. And with that, I'll give it to Jody to kick us off.
That was beautiful, Jude. Thank you so much. And I was a little bit multitasking there. And now that I'm sharing my screen, which hopefully you all can see. Yep, good. I'm seeing some nods and thumbs up. Wonderful. I can no longer see the waiting room or the chat. So Jude, I might have you and Allison help me out there. We also are very aware that you all have a ton of work on your plates. We're in year 3 of a pandemic and we already had, a crisis on our hands in homeless and housing world. We know there's a lot of vacancies in a lot of your organizations and you may be pulling extra shifts and doing double duty or both of those things. So part of what we want to do is make sure that we've got really accessible information and materials, and then we really want to learn how we can support you. So with all of that, we're going to kick it off with, a low barrier trauma-informed approach to voting rights and registration. So little bit of background on the Seattle King County Coalition on Homelessness. If you're not familiar with us, we, as Jude said, we are also a nonprofit 501c3, so we do nonpartisan work. Our mission is we mobilize community to challenge systemic causes of homelessness and advocate for housing justice. So for those of you that do know us, we do a lot of policy advocacy at the state, local, and increasingly, state, local, oh, geez Louise, I'm not having the best afternoon, folks, so bear with me. The city, county, and increasingly at the state level. We do trainings like this, and then across the board for a lot of different community care, a lot of case manager trainings. We do monthly meetings for providers, and then we do voter registration. We really see this as part of our racial equity work, and we're going to take a deep dive into that with Jude here in a couple minutes. But we're really trying to build political power because we need systemic change, and we really need the people that are most deeply affected by the decisions that are being made around policy and budgets that have direct impact on their lives. So that's how we show up in this work. And I will pass it off to Jude. Oh,
perfect.
there you go.
Julie. We are also a nonprofit 501(c)(3) organization, and the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle empowers African Americans to thrive by securing educational and economic opportunities. And so that work goes into 5 focus areas such as housing, workforce development, education, public health, and then my team specifically deals with advocacy and community engagement. We definitely have a vision that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so with the deep historical legacy of the Black community in Seattle and due to gentrification and displacement and other traumatic pressures, that movement out of Seattle as well, our goal is to provide opportunities that are going to enrich our community and in turn support as a whole all the underserved communities in our area too.
Great. And okay. Jude, let me know that y'all can see the notes and stuff too. So let me just stop sharing and see if I can get this to a better screen here. Hang on. How's that? Are you seeing that? Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Jude. All right. There you go. So I think Jude covered this really well, so we're not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time on this, but what I will say is the whole goal is for us to get you feeling way more comfortable about voter registration, rights, education. As Jude said, doing this in a way that doesn't cause harm, that really understands the connections to trauma, racism, homelessness. And we are going to talk about some heavy topics. So I just want to be real clear that can be triggering for folks. And so please do what you need to do to take care of you. If you're finding some of this conversation hard, we can always follow back up with you and get you the materials you need. So on that note, we'll just keep it going. Take it away, Jude.
Yeah, so I think to kind of kick off our discussion, I think one concern that we often heard for folks working in direct service is I'm not sure that the people I serve will be interested in voting. And this is a common misconception that we also hope to tackle today, because just because someone is socioeconomically disadvantaged or homeless doesn't mean that they're not interested in politics. If anything, most political decision making is going to have the greatest impact on them, or vice versa, is going to be completely exclusive of these communities, and thus we need their participation. And as a wider community, we need to put the effort in to support and elevate their voices as well. But it is true, many people do want to vote, but what stops people from voting are barriers that we're going to be able to dive into. So if we can agree to work together to overcome these barriers, whether that's on an individual level, but also looking at systemic change as well as part of our bigger picture, we can make voting a priority and make it far more accessible and thus get those crucial voices into our community. Next slide. So we just wanted to start this off with a discussion with you all. What are some barriers to getting people experiencing homelessness registered to vote? We have some ideas, but for those of y'all, you're often experts in your field. So if anyone wants to share in the chat or raise their hand, that would be awesome. I see some nods, some interest, but maybe Jody, you could kick us off with an example.
Well, I think we did get one chat mention photo and ID, and you are 100% correct, Phoebe. That is a huge barrier. So that's one of them, lack of resources. Another is misinformation. I don't know if any of you all have any experience with that, but we're also going to talk about a little bit of that too.
And I think one big part of this presentation too is we wanted to address a lot of the barriers that we know of, that we have experienced out in community, but we also want throughout this presentation, like, please feel free to share in the chat or, by raising your hand and unmuting yourself, what has been your experience? What have folks come to you asking questions about? Allison, not thinking they can vote, that's a really big one. I know that's one I hear constantly is folks saying, I don't have an address, so I can't vote, right? Or I was in prison, so I can't vote, right? And these are all, I would say, in some ways, calculated misinformation that prevents a lot of voices from being heard. Awesome. So some of the ones that we named, Jody got misinformation. Phoebe, you definitely touched on the lack of access to resources. I would say also culturally appropriate or in language materials. We'll get to learn about some of the language options that are available to voters. But these are often things that people have to opt in or seek out in order to utilize. And that's often where us as service providers can find opportunities to provide some of that support. And Barbara, you also hit a huge one. People totally say my vote won't count, so why vote? So we definitely have, as a society, internalized ideas that our vote doesn't matter. And that's another massive issue that we want to tackle in conjunction with that mistrust with our current electoral institutions. And so we'll kind of go into how those ideas intersect. But to just kick us off on our presentation, we just want to make sure that we are all in the same page, that when we are talking about racism, today we're going to be focused on structural racism. So this is racism that occurs across time, across institutions. This is something deeper than our everyday individual interactions. And that's not to say that individual and institutional racism don't play a role in whether folks vote. They certainly do. But I think a lot of the issues that we're going to touch on are looking at patterns across voting, patterns across exclusion from voting as well. And then in particularly the way in which policies, practices, and programs were intended or as an outcome affect communities of color more than they may compare to white communities. Next slide. And Jody, as always, feel free to hop in with anything you want to add. But just to really kind of hone in again on structural racism, we want to really identify that it is a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. So this isn't something that we can avoid or turn our backs from. We need to actively address it in order to actually tackle racism. There's no sitting on the sideline. There's no being a backseat driver with this one.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that, when we really start to have good conversations around racism, and particularly at that systemic structural level, it can be really hard for white folks to identify how they are impacted negatively by racism. It's very easy for a lot of us to identify how we benefit, but we're also impacted negatively. And so, as Jude said, we all have a role to play because we're all swimming in this crap together. So.
Awesome. So I want to take a moment to hone in on voting rights as well, and also why voting matters. So that, original question of like, are people interested in votes? So when we talk about voting rights, we're talking about two things. So the first is the constitutional and legal definition of who is eligible to vote. But the second part of voting rights is the ability of every voter to actually exercise their right to vote and cast a vote that is going to be counted. So there's kind of a differentiation between two things. And again, going back to that conversation on structural racism, people might say, hey, we have have full voting rights at the federal and state level based on the Voting Rights Act, whether it's Washington's or the federal one of 1965. But there's many barriers in place that prevent folks from actually being able to use their right to vote. And so that's going to be, I think, where a lot of our discussion and when we talk about the barriers to voting faced by houseless individuals, that is where we see a breakdown of their voting rights. But, never fear. Voting rights have changed over time and they continue to evolve. So we want you to know that this isn't just an issue that was settled in 1965. There are voting right cases going through the courts every single day across the country, and that's driving changes in voting rights, how we vote, and bringing up those discussions on how we can reduce barriers and get more voices into our electoral system. Next slide. So this is going to be two very text-heavy slides. I'm not going to go too deep into this timeline because I want to be mindful of time and give us more opportunity to discuss some of those technicalities around voting. But you will all be able to access this presentation. It's also available on the Urban League website, this specific timeline. But what I really want to highlight is to just take a moment to look at those dates that are on the left side. In particular, 1870, this was when the 15th Amendment granted citizenship and the right to vote to all men, regardless of race, color, or condition of servitude. And so one thing that's important to note about voting rights is that amendments set expectations for the federal government to protect this right to vote. However, it is states themselves that often have the power to set standards for voting rights. And so that's why we have different voting systems in pretty much every single state, different laws, different eligibility rules. So that's something to keep an eye out for. When you're talking with folks, if they come from another state, they probably don't know the ins and outs of voter eligibility in Washington state. They're probably not familiar with mail-in voting or the top two primary system that we utilize. And so that's just a helpful piece to keep in context, like it's always changing. The second thing I want to highlight is these two key dates, 1958 and 1965. 1965 kind of being that hallmark date that we say the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, racial discrimination in voting is prohibited, and the federal government has the responsibility to enforce that. I asked some students, some high school students today when the civil rights movement was, and they said the 1700s. And then someone was like, no, it's the 1800s, duh. And I think that is more of a testament to the fact that we think that the battle for voting rights and that very pivotal act happened over 100 years ago. When that's not true, this was less than 100 years ago. So voting rights are new, and I think we don't just want to be disheartened by by barriers that exist today, but definitely just keeping in mind that, the US is a new country. Full voting rights are new. So it is going to take time for our government as well as our communities to create that effective citizenship to make voting as effective as possible. Next slide. And these last two dates in 2013 and 2022 just really highlight that we're continuing to battle for voting rights today. One thing I think we can be pretty grateful about living in Washington state and voting in Washington state, if you do, is that we have a lot of legislation that sets a very high bar for voter access, right? And so we want to really elevate that, support that, celebrate that, and get that news out to community, because this is something that we probably take for granted here, whereas in other states, voter ID laws and other forms of voter suppression make it very difficult for especially communities of color to come out and vote. So this is a battle that continues to be fought, whether you want to fight it on the advocacy side, or we're going to give you some battles today to do as an individual and as a service provider. Next slide. So racism and elections have been closely intertwined. So we've got a couple different examples of ways in which you can, with data, see the policies that create racist structures that prevent especially people of color from going out and voting. And kind of similarly, a lot of these examples are not in the US. Or not in, it's not in the US, sorry, not in Washington state. So we might be inclined to think, oh, that's not a problem here. But we see a lot of the similar negative effects, maybe if it's not as obvious or codified. We see a lot of similar issues happening to our communities here in Washington as well. So I can think, as an organizer with voter outreach, we have really dismal voter education for youth. And we do not have required 4 years of civics classes. We have very little citizenship strategies. And so a lot of people become eligible to vote and then know nothing about voting, unless, say, you're from a family that is very familiar with voting and votes consistently and is able to specifically teach you. So that's just one example about voter outreach. But we can think about different barriers here that also maybe have racist implications. So I would say, even when we're looking at access to ballot boxes, access to mailboxes to be able to turn into your ballot. If we go to the next slide, we've got some examples of voter ID laws that happen across the US that are very restrictive. And even though we have very open voter ID laws here in Washington, we still do require ID. We still do make it harder for people to register to vote if they don't have, say, a driver's license, which costs $140. So think about who's able to pay $140 for a license and then easily apply to register to vote at the DMV, right? That's not everyone. So there's countless studies that you can dive into the ways that racism has impacted our elections. And what I usually recommend for folks is to definitely hear out communities of color and organizations that have staff from communities of color in Washington about what are some of the common issues that they run into when it comes to voting and actually getting your vote to count. Like one example is with our primary system here. There's a big movement, definitely stewarded by leaders of color throughout Washington state, to implement ranked choice voting instead of our current top 2 primary system. And one reason that I can get behind that as a person of color is that I know the history of primaries, which is that primaries began in Texas as white primaries. They were a strategy by the political parties to prevent Black voters from participating in the primary elections. And then effectively, whoever was chosen in the primary election and went on to the general would win the general. So that effectively excluded Black voters from that very beginning stage of voting, right? And today we can see kind of similar legacies in our primaries in Washington. Our voter turnout in the primaries is half of our voter turnout in the general election. Predominantly white, older folks are the ones that vote in primaries. So I think definitely hearing out communities of color when they point out things like that, that don't sit well, that don't effectively serve their communities, is one great way to learn about barriers that we can take to address. Next slide.
Thank you, Jude. So part of what we're trying to do is really set some context for when you engage in these conversations, really understanding these relationships and these intersections. And I think Jude made a really great point about that Washington has a lot in place that helps remove a lot of barriers, right? So voter ID being one of them, right? we're going to get into this into some more detail, but as someone experiencing homelessness, ID is extremely expensive and it's hard to get, but you don't need an actual ID. There are alternate forms of ID that Jude's going to go into later in this training, but you can also use the last 4 digits of your social security number. So we're going to talk about some of those ways in which barriers that have historically been in place, we can have alternatives to that. But it's also really important, like Jude said, if somebody's coming in from a different state or has never been given this education or information around voting and voting rights history, they may not really have a whole lot of information. Also, we want to be thinking about, we're going to get into different types of trauma, racism being a type of trauma, homelessness being a type of trauma. And as Jude just laid out, voter suppression is a source of, community trauma, and we'll talk about that. And these things all intersect, right? We can't really talk about one without talking about the other, or at least having that context as part of how we're approaching this work. So we really wanted to just bring these things together in a way that makes sense for the folks that we are working with. This is not apolitical, and it's certainly not ahistorical. Majority of folks experiencing homelessness in the US and certainly here in King County, disproportionately BIPOC, identify as BIPOC, right? Voter suppression disproportionately targets BIPOC communities. So this is kind of the context that we just wanted to kind of start to talk about as we talk about trauma. So just like we did with racism, let's really ground into what we're talking about when we say trauma. I have 2 different definitions up here. The top one is from SAMHSA, and the other is a little bit more of a community interpretation of that, which I really like. But it's an injury, and this can be a physical or an emotional injury. It's causing levels of shock and pain that can result in an ongoing suffering, whether that's physical, whether that's mental. But really, as the second definition is getting into, it is an ordinary bodily response to an extraordinary situation, right? So it's something that is happening in our bodies. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that trauma and subsequent stress from trauma can actually change our bodies. And this is just important because, again, we're working with a lot of folks that have trauma histories. And so we want to be able to engage them the best way we can. Trauma tends to overwhelm our ability to cope. So this isn't just any old bad thing or bad day that happens to you. We usually have our abilities to handle those things. Trauma is something that tends to overwhelm that, right? So our usual ways of surviving, picking up and moving on aren't working, or they're not working very well. Again, it's a protective response to something that might actually be dangerous, but also might just be perceived as dangerous. We experience it differently. So you and I can have the exact same experience and you walk away relatively okay, right? You've got some resilience, you've got some protective buffers and factors, your coping is working really well. I might walk away traumatized. And that's okay, right? We're really, really different. There's a lot of things that go into why I might walk away with a traumatic experience and you walk away without one. Most of us have heard of fight, flight, and freeze as becoming even more and more known and common in terms of how our nervous system will respond to trauma. But there's also fornicate, so leaning into pleasure, feast and famine, right? Some of us are going to have comfort or emotional eating. Some of us are, that just shuts down and we actually end up not getting the nutrition and the food that we need. And then flop is where we're just, it's not full avoidance, but we're really diminished in our ability to engage. So we'll talk a little bit about how these different things can show up in our body in different ways. So this is certainly not an exhaustive list of trauma, but it's a pretty good list that ticks off some of the bigger categories of trauma. We are not going to get into secondary trauma at all today. We just don't have the time, but I will say that this is a pretty important component in terms of how we show up for ourselves and how we can then show up for each other. So I'm happy to get folks resources on that if need be. You know, food insecurity is not on here. I'm just going to kind of take a minute to pause. I have a whole other slide that we're going to move into around historical and community trauma, but I just want to kind of pause and check in with folks and just see if there's any questions that have come up in terms of how we're talking about trauma so far. Anything you want to clarify, anything you want to add from your own journeys, because I know a lot of you have had this type of training before.
So I guess one thing that I've heard quite a bit about is generational trauma. I wonder if that falls in under secondary trauma. But I think also with regards to folks whose families have been in the US for a long time, who have attempted to vote for a long time, who maybe have successfully voted, but with violence or with different barriers or unpleasant experiences that occurred. I think that's definitely one that I'm thinking of right now.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question, Jude, because I think when you're talking about generational or historical or community trauma, I think it could fall in that category, and we'll just throw that slide up there right now. But what you're talking about too is secondary trauma is the effects that we feel when we are working with somebody, hearing somebody, seeing someone else's trauma. So we're not directly experiencing it ourselves. We may not be experiencing homelessness ourselves or experiencing interpersonal violence, but we are hearing about it, or we're helping clients or loved ones navigate that or try to get out of those situations, and that can weigh on us quite extensively. I will just say, because it's on my mind, you know, there is a study right now for homeless service providers around trauma, primary and secondary trauma that we experience doing this work. You know, so that's a key thing. That's why I want to recognize that it's a huge part of talking about trauma, and we're not really going to do that today. So like I said, touch base with me if you want. But that generational or that historical trauma is these huge, big, powerful events or circumstances that are usually lasting effects on how someone walks through the world, sees the world, their emotions, their thinking, and it can carry from one generation to another. And it can carry from one generation to another, both in, as Jude said, sort of a witnessing and understanding of how one's family or one's community has or has not been able to access services, privileges, rights, but it can actually pass through genetically. And there's a whole body of work on that as well. But we're talking about those, you know, those huge emotional and psychological wounds. So think genocide, slavery, destruction of cultural practices, language. When I do this training in another context, I have a different slide that really talks about some things that have happened here in the Pacific Northwest, right? So think mass incarceration, think internment of Japanese citizens, boarding schools, right? These are all things that like are happened here on the land that we are on, and continue to happen or have ongoing effects. So just going to pause again, because a lot of this is pretty heavy, and I just want to make sure that there's nothing else coming up for folks before we kind of really start to move into how this looks in the body. Okay. Try to be really good about the 10-second rule. Like that's what they tell you as a facilitator. You have to pause for a full 10 seconds for the person that's like, do I want to? But we will move on. And we can always come back to this. I threw it into the chat, but it's worth mentioning. Jude and I really are trying to have this planned out so that we've got a good amount of time to Phoebe threw a really great question into the chat already, and how we can support you. And then I'm seeing Allison says, sometimes there's also the trauma about the way people have asked for help and have not gotten what they needed in helping organizations. Yeah, for sure. That's a great one that's missing off of that, right? When our systems don't really work as well as they could or should, and the effects of that. So trauma in the body, right? This is really where our nervous system is pushed beyond a point where it can really do what it's supposed to do, which is regulate itself, right? We've got the, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and they balance each other out. And I'm not going to go into those depths of the science here. But what it can do is when our nervous system has a sustained response, this is when really we start to see effects of our body, right? And it can lead to those chronic health issues. And I use health broadly, right? So physical diagnoses, medical diagnoses, but also emotional, mental, and social issues that can also affect us. And we really do start to see this happening within brain structure shifting, and the immune system in particular, and hormone system having direct effect from this. So let's just, again, be real clear when we're talking about stress. We usually talk about it in these three ways, right? So that positive stress, it's the quick spike in usually your adrenaline, and it comes back pretty quickly, right? So brief, mild elevations in heart rate, blood pressure. This is what's going to help you avoid that car accident. This is what's going to help you win the basketball tournament, pass that hard test. That's normal, right? Then this tolerable stress is where you have an event that's you're gonna have a little bit of a bigger stress response, and it might last a little bit longer. But again, it's an incident that most of us expect to have within our lifetime, right? Most of us expect that we're gonna have an illness that we're going to have to deal with, whether it's ours or a loved one. Someone, a loved one or a pet or a family member passes away, and we have to deal with that grief. It's the toxic stress where we start to see that shift into cortisol and those sustained levels of cortisol. And that's what really starts to disrupt our body processes. And we really start to see that long-term risk for disease, cognitive impairment. So what happens is we start to see our response systems, they start to respond at a much lower threshold. They activate much more frequently because of that, and then they stay on for longer periods of time. So I always like to share, I'm somebody that, has my own trauma history. I have anxiety that was largely unrecognized and undiagnosed for most of my life. And I was well into my 40s by the time I was like, maybe I'm not a worrier, maybe I have anxiety. And what had happened to me is I would hear a car backfire. I would hear, metal garbage cans or dumpsters that would clang. And I would immediately, all of my muscles would tense up. My heart rate would just go berserk. I would get flushed into the skin. My blood pressure would rise. I'm like this, right? And I'm waiting for something to happen to me or to witness something horrible happening to somebody else. That was just my response all the time, every time. And it would take an hour at least for me to really come back to sort of baseline and to feel relaxed again. So it's kind of like a hypervigilance or a hyper arousal is another, kind of two slightly different things, but connected, right? So when people are living in that space all the time, and especially during, kind of early periods of development, so we're thinking younger folks, but adults are also affected by this, those regions of our brain that are associated with anxiety and fear and impulse control, they start to get bigger and stronger, and they have more synapses that are firing, right? So again, firing at lower thresholds, staying on for longer. And then it becomes harder to actually do some of that reasoning, that behavioral control, that planning. And here's where, again, we get back to that idea that trauma is different for everybody. Well, part of that is trauma could have you could have experienced trauma years ago, and then something relatively normal in the moment, like a car backfiring, you have this huge response that doesn't quite match what an outside observer might make that equation, right? And so this is just something we want to be mindful of as we are working with our folks, not just for voting registration, but in general as we work with our folks, right? So who knows what might re-trigger somebody? So it's really important to have that understanding of how prevalent trauma is in our society, which it is, and what it can kind of look like. So that's something that you can more readily go, oh, is this a trauma response? And then you can kind of shift how you're engaging with somebody to respond to them in that moment. So also not an exhaustive list, but this is how it can kind of show up in the moment and in people's bodies, right? So people really are more susceptible to colds and infections, you know, and taking a longer time to heal. Sleep disturbances, right? All of those pains and aches and muscle related muscle tension, things that are not directly linked to a like a medical diagnosis, right? Like, so think about the headache, you know, that's not your migraine, that's thankfully not a brain tumor, the stomach ache that's not related to a GI thing, right? Those are real physical sensations that people are having, and it's quite possibly related to mental health and trauma. People can have a really hard time making decisions, processing information, remembering things. And so part of when we talk about having a trauma-informed approach is having really clear and consistent communication. We'll get into that a little bit later. But just again, think about, you know, when folks are showing up with you in these ways, it's likely that there's some re-triggering of a trauma that might be at play here. But we can heal. That's the beauty. And this is not, I can never remember the right word, but it's not determinative, right? Just because you have a trauma history doesn't mean you're going to have these things, but it is a risk factor. And so we want to be aware of that for folks, right? And even if it has happened, so for me, 40-something-year-old Jody realizes she has generalized anxiety disorder. And, you know, I started meditation. Hugely helpful. I can now hear a car backfire, and yeah, I still have the startle that most of us would have, but like it's within minutes that I come back to my baseline, right? So we are able to recover and heal and connect back with our bodies and our communities in really wonderful and positive ways. So resilience is a buzzword. This is the most basic definition that I could find. There's lots of other definitions that might resonate better for you, but it's really just our ability to recover quickly when we're faced with adversity. We as professionals and the peers that we engage with, hugely powerful in our ability to create strong relationships that can really build resilience in folks. This next slide is going to be about things that bolster resilience, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that can be protective factors that really do buffer and help us heal from trauma. But just like, you know, exercising a muscle, you can't just like, you know, do your exercise, build that muscle up, and then you're good for life, right? Like it's you know, it's time limited. We gotta keep getting the resilience moments to continue to bolster us. So also not an exhaustive list. I would love to hear if there's anything that I should be putting in my last 2 empty boxes, because I also don't like having those boxes empty. I threw voting in there. I think it's very much embedded in connection to community and culture. And I think it's also very much embedded in meaningful activity. And I think this is really important for us as homeless and housing service providers to really call that out, right? So much of trauma has us feeling disconnected, right? Has us having a hard time connecting and having that meaningful activity. And I think homelessness in and of itself really likes to do damage in these 2 areas, right? So this is a huge way that we might be able to connect with folks as part of their healing process, right? Along with all these other things. So I'm just going to pause, just checking in with folks, anything that's like jumping up, anything that you want to call me out on, anything you want to add from your own experience. Okay, I think we're doing pretty good on time here too, folks. So again, trauma really, really disrupts our connection with people. And most of us really just, we want to be seen and heard, and kind of going back to Allison's comment, right? When you're seeking out at an organization and you're looking for help, or you're looking to somebody and that need doesn't get met for whatever reason, right? There could be a lot of really legitimate reasons why a need might not be getting met. But being able to see what that person's need is, being able to connect with them, talk about how we might be able to get that need met, that's an important piece here, right? And then that loss of control is huge when we talk about a trauma history. So these are some of the things that we're going to start to see incorporated in how to become trauma informed, or incorporate that a little bit more in our work, right? So I did not realize this was one of those transition slides. There we go. Okay. So part of being trauma informed really is understanding that so many of us have a trauma history. It's quite pervasive. This is something that we learned from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. That was a whole section of this training that I took out, but it's a seminal study that was done in the 90s with CDC and Kaiser, and there's problems about it. It was, you know, had a very privileged lens on it, both economically, racially. So it's there's definitely criticism that can be had with it, but it really launched a lot of this trauma-informed work and really understanding the nature of trauma. We're really trying to heal and have healing environments. So I think when we talk a lot about voter registration, and particularly when we do this with our volunteers at the coalition, like, yeah, do we want to get every single person registered to vote? Of course we do. Do we want to do it at the expense of, like, you know, being, you know, all up in their business? No, of course not, right? So really creating that space for empowerment, choice, collaboration, and trust, right? Even if that is, and I will probably say this again in another couple of slides, if the, you know, we want to, hey, are you interested in learning more about registering to vote? And the answer is a hard no, then we just like, thanks, see you later. They might come back, right? One easy, well, I shouldn't say easy. This can actually be really hard if you've never done it before, but it's also an easy entry point for people to start practicing. And probably most of you already are doing this, at least on some level. But that person first language. When they've looked at this in medical studies, and particularly around substance use, it's not about, you know, sort of being quote unquote politically correct. Like, neutral language, non-stigmatizing language actually improves people's acceptance of services, and particularly treatment services for folks, right? It's just that, right? It's not the homeless, or, you know, homeless people, it's people experiencing or person living. The other thing is we just really want to, and this I think is, all of us are, I think, working on this more and more, but that gender neutral language, right? It's very hard, I will say, for me, and I will assume I have good company with you all here. We read a person and we assume their gender based on how they look, right? That's very common. And that's one of those ones that we really need to practice around, not assuming that we know how someone identifies. So finding those gender neutral words or phrases will be really helpful, particularly if you've got people coming up together. Just a little thing to keep in mind and to start practicing whenever you can. So again, people could be triggered right before they come up to the desk, right? Or to ask you about voter registration. So think about what happened to them 5 minutes before on the bus, right as they were getting off, and then start where they are. And part of that is what the coalition does and what Jude does in a lot of her work, right, is we take this work out into the community. Where are people accessing services? Where are they living? Where are they getting meals? Where are they meeting with case managers? And that's where you all are going to be super key, right, for us to be able to help get you feeling better about that and more comfortable with that, this material. But also just, you know, starting where people are emotionally and behaviorally, right? Someone might be really wanting to engage and have that connection, and they don't really care in that moment about voter registration. That's still a moment for us to connect, right? And we see this all the time where folks are continuing to come and engage and talk, and it might be many, many times before they're ready to actually talk about the thing that you might be interested in talking about. Be mindful of that communication, and this is going a little bit deeper into not just that person first or gender neutral language, but I mentioned it before. Really clear and really consistent. That can actually help folks in terms of their trauma. It can help ground them into that moment and be able to process some of that information a little bit better. Repetition is also super, super helpful, and that also helps people process information. And short sentences, you know, words that are 5 letters or less, pauses as people are taking information in, because again, if they're in a moment where their body is responding, you know, they could be really flooded, they could be kind of starting to do that avoidance, they might be hyper aroused and are paying attention to a number of things, including you. And then we really want to avoid putting someone in a situation where they have to disclose any sensitive information. And this can be hard because I think a lot of us, you know, want to maybe ask like, oh, are you interested in getting registered to vote? Or are you registered to vote? And they say no. And it's like, oh, how come you're not registered to vote? Well, then that person is now put in a position where they have to either share with you, I'm not eligible because I'm not a citizen. You know, which actually just happened recently to me, you know, that they don't want to vote, you know, and that's an uncomfortable thing. So try to open up and just say, hey, you know, there's been a lot of changes to voter eligibility, and can I share information with you about those changes? And that again puts that control back into people's realm to say, yeah, tell me more, or no, I'm not really interested in that. Forecasting, really important, right? So again, people need to know what to expect, because again, that can help them regulate their nervous system response, right? If they're constantly assessing and trying to figure out what's happening and what's going on, the more information they have up front, the less they can kind of worry about it, right? So let them know what's going to happen. Let them know how long it's going to take. It helps get them into that moment, and then again helps them really understand, you know, we're almost done. She said this was only going to be another, I just have to fill out these 5 pieces, the rest of it I can ignore, you know. Kind of already talked about choices and permission, but just start practicing kind of inviting people into the conversation with you. You know, so a lot of times when I'm out, you know, I do start with that, like, oh, there's lots of changes in 2022. Can I share them with you? We're looking for community messengers. I want to make sure people know, even if it doesn't apply to them. Again, they don't have to then disclose anything about themselves that they don't want to. And then key, center yourself, right? Before you get in. We all have the stuff that we're dealing with and whatever's going on in our lives. And if you can just take that moment, and it truly is a moment, right? Feet on the floor, hands on your thighs, 3 deep breaths, and then you're kind of locked into that moment. It will allow you to engage with people and to sort of see where they are and meet them where they are a little bit easier, I think. So I think we're doing pretty good on time. I'm going to hand it over to Jude to like dive into actual registration and voter registration and all the ins and outs of that.
Awesome. So now that we've learned some great trauma-informed care tips on how to start that conversation around voting, next we're going to actually dive into how to register to vote, as well as some key tips and tricks to make sure that your vote does count. And again, this is all information. We pretty much get all of this info from the Secretary of State's website. You can also check out the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle's website, as well as the Coalition on Homelessness of Seattle and King County. I know we all have different guides that'll highlight these various ways to register. But this is going to be a really good opportunity if you have questions, if there's any specific circumstances that you think of that you want to know what the route would be. This is going to be a great opportunity for that. So I'm going to start by just highlighting the ways to register to vote in Washington, right? That is our very first step. And kind of starting from, in some ways, the easiest way to register, but in some ways the least accessible, is registering to vote online. The link is really easy. It's OLVR, stands for Online Voter Registration, .votewashington.gov. If you also just Google register to vote online in Washington, it'll be the first link that comes up. With online voting, a registrant is required to have a valid Washington State ID or Washington State driver's license. So that's where we kind of say that it might be, a lot of folks may have expired licenses or licenses from out of states, or maybe they don't have that ID. But of course, there's going to be workarounds, and that I think goes with that previous trauma-informed care tip of offering choices, right? So if you can know all the different options for folks to register, you can help offer choices and find what's going to work best for that individual. The second common way to register to vote in Washington is by mail using a paper voter registration form. Those are easily printable from the Secretary of State's website in like 25 different languages. But also you can reach out to community organizations such as us. We probably just have a bunch on hand that we can mail or deliver to you. The mail form, you can register using a valid Washington ID or license, or you can use the last 4 digits of your social security number. With both of these methods of registering to vote, the registration has to be received 8 days before the election day. So for those of you that might not know, in Washington, we have an 18-day voting period. So for example, our primary election is coming up on August 2nd, but the voting period actually begins July 15th. So by July 15th, ballots will be out in the mail. You can still register to vote. You can also go online and print a ballot online as well if you don't receive it in the mail for some reason. And you have until August 2nd at 8 p.m. To do all of those tasks. But with registration, if say you have someone on July 30th, a few days before election day, and they're like, oh my gosh, I want to register to vote and be able to vote in the primary, you cannot use online or mail registration. That individual will actually have to go in person into an elections office or vote centers. And starting the 18-day voting periods, elections office and vote centers will be open, and you'll be able to even register someone on the day of the election if they go in person. And so, of course, that requires them physically being at one of the locations where there's elections office staff. So that's something where you as an expert, you can look at where are the nearest elections office. If it's really far, I know in King County it's in Renton. If that's not accessible to folks, you might want to look at vote centers. They are, there's one I believe in downtown Seattle. There's one at University of Washington. They're going to be a little bit more dispersed throughout King County, using that as my example. But also, you might have the resources to look up real quick on your phone. Is there a bus that goes there? Are there any organizations that can help with transportation, that can help provide bus fare? So depending on, how much time you have with the person, how interested and engaged they are at voting, we can find workarounds and options to help them get registered. Next slide. And of course, I want to kind of review some eligibility requirements, because if you're out talking to folks about voting, I hear it every single time that someone cannot vote. And I would say like 5 out of 10 times, like they actually can vote. And so just want to take a moment to be really clear about what eligibility means in Washington state. And remember, voting laws are different in every state. And so this is specific to Washington. So someone might come and say like, I can't vote, I have a felony conviction, I've, tried for years. Maybe they don't know that Washington recently changed that law, or they came from another state where they were told, you'll never vote again, you lose this forever, which is something that's not true, but unfortunately is a piece of misinformation that a lot of folks end up getting. So with eligibility requirements, being a US citizen is required to vote in Washington. You need to have lived in Washington for 30 days before the election. There isn't a confirmation piece for that. So it's not like you have to provide proof of like a lease that you moved 30 days before the election. As long as you're here, you're good to go. You also, to vote, need to be 18 years old by the day of the election in which they first vote. And so this is cool because we have a program in Washington to specifically register 16 and 17-year-olds. And a voter who turns 18 between the August primary and the November general election can actually vote in the primary. So that's really cool because like 17-year-old voters, like that's something that I don't think most people can say they've done. You're part of a very niche group of youth that have had that cool opportunity. So if you're talking to high schoolers, you're talking to youth, get them engaged, point out 16 isn't that far away. Maybe they're already 16, and before they know it, they'll be voting and need to know this information as well. Another big piece is not disqualified due to a court order declaring someone mentally incompetent to vote. That's the language in Washington state law. This tends to confuse people because a lot of people think that they can't vote because they have a court order. That is not true. The only case in which a court order can disqualify someone from voting is one that specifically declares someone as, in term they use, is mentally incompetent. And so most likely you're not going to run into as many people. But if someone says, I have a court order, I can't vote, take a moment to point that out to them. And then this last one, not under total confinement for a Washington felony conviction. This changed in January 1st of 2022. Now a person's right to vote is restored once they are released from the Department of Corrections and they can re-register to vote. So a lot of folks think that because they have a felony conviction, they cannot vote at all. If they are out in community, they can vote. So I cannot tell you, I've heard this over and over and over again. I've been out tabling and someone has said, I just got out of prison 2 weeks ago, I'm not eligible to vote. And the best thing is to say, if you're standing right in front of me, you can vote. So that's a really big one. That's a big misinformation piece that we are working really hard to change. And that's a great one to throw out to people because you never know who has a felony conviction, whose loved ones, coworkers, peers, friends think that they can't vote. So even be able to share this information can be really valuable if someone remembers that and brings it up to someone and is able to help someone re-register to vote as well. So that is another piece. They have to register again if they registered before their conviction and before being totally under full confinement with a felony conviction, they were unregistered and removed from the voter rolls. So they do need to take that extra step once again. Next slide. Oh, and if anyone has any question, again, please feel free to stop me or drop it in the chat.
Well, and if you have got a question on Jude, I just want to throw in two more things. Just to be really clear, this has been true for a while, but people can have, legal financial obligations, court debts. That also is not keep them from voting in Washington. Sometimes those things get all conflated. And then the other thing I want to say is, we have some beautiful artwork. So Urban League and the Coalition on Homelessness are also part of the Washington Voting Rights Restoration Coalition, which was a huge part of getting this law changed, along with Representative Tara Simmons. We have beautiful artwork that displays this message in really wonderful ways. And I was at the United Way Community Barbecue a couple weeks ago, had our posters up, gentleman came up and started looking at the poster because, really, I don't think wanted to engage with us. I think he was just curious about the poster, turned to us and just said, "I can vote?" And I said, "Well, tell me more." But yeah, I mean, this law changed and we got him registered to vote on the spot. So we can also get you that information so you can put this beautiful artwork up around. Sorry for that interlude, Jude. Next slide. Although maybe there's something in the chat. Oh, Allison's thrown it in there. Way to go.
And I also just added the link if you did want to download some of the posters and social media pieces that they have. Anything that you do to get the word out about this, whether it's hanging it up in your office, leaving it on your car windshield, posting it on social media, would be super valid. The next piece that we wanted to go into was talking a little bit about filling out a voter registration form. I would say this is the most common way that I tend to register folks to vote, particularly because people will often know the last 4 digits of their social security number. And so with that, the voter registration form is helpful. This is also the route that you want to go if someone does not have their last 4 digits of their social security number or a Washington state ID on hand. This form is going to be one of the most accessible and effective ways to still help them get registered. But then, of course, we'll get into this a little bit later. There's going to be an extra step for them to take. But real quick, I just want to go over what the required information is on the form. A lot of people look at it, they go, "That's a lot of spaces. I don't want to fill that out." And so before they walk away, I will point out that the most important sections for them to fill out are going to be their name, their date of birth, their residential address. So I describe this as where people are most of the time. Your residential address is going to determine your voting district. So who you vote for, what city council you're a part of, what legislative district you're a part of. It can't be a PO box, but it can be something as simple as like a cross street or just an identifiable address. So if someone knows that they identify with a Seattle Public Library, they could put that address as their residential address. What is also key is that if their residential address is not where that person lives, they'll also, or where that person can access their mail, they're also going to want to put a mailing address because that is where their ballot gets set. That is where their voter ID gets sent. And so we really want to make sure that the mailing address is an accessible location. So often, I know Jody will go more into depth of this, but sometimes I'll recommend you can set your mailing address as a family member, as a friend, as a workplace, as maybe a shelter or an organization that you go to for services. I believe the Urban League gets a couple ballots every election from folks that have set us as their mailing address so they could come and pick it up from us. The next piece that folks really need to fill out is under that second section, that second black header, just says your eligibility statement. And so the first one is saying, "I'm a citizen of the United States of America." The second one basically says, "I will be at least 18 years old by the first election that I vote in." The new voter registration forms have like 2 sentences on that, but basically that second bullet just means, are you older than 16? Cool. So that's going to be a big piece that we need them to fill out. If they skip the age question, they can also just check your date of birth. Voting forms are processed by people, and so they can make those common sense decisions or follow up to confirm information with any voter. Also, I forgot to highlight on that first section, there's a phone number or email address, and those are optional, but I really try to get every single person, as long as they have an email or phone that they use, I really try to get them to include that information, because if there's any questions that the elections office has about your voter registration, they'll send you some snail mail, but sometimes it is easier for folks to get a phone call or an email address as well. But going back down to that fourth section, there's a space for your Washington ID number or the last 4 digits of your social security number. But that section, if it is left blank, they will still process the form and they will reach out to the voter, either again through that mailing address, their phone number, or their email, to get an alternative form of acceptable ID. So it's not required to submit the form, but you are going to let them know that they're going to have to take that extra step. And then the last important piece at the very bottom is the declaration. And you want to use your signature and date it. A key point about signatures is that it matters. The signature that you use on a voter registration form is going to be what they use to verify that you're the one that voted on your ballot, because every ballot you're going to sign the outside. So you want to use that same signature. So sometimes I'll give folks the option to practice a few times if they don't have one that they're used to using. If someone has phone, I'll recommend they take a picture of their phone, maybe even like sign it on the form and then sign another piece of paper and keep that with them for reference. So again, lots of options on how to make voting as accessible as possible. Next slide, and I'll kind of let Jody touch on this part as well.
Yeah, and I'm mindful of time, so I think what I really want to pull out, just to go a little deeper into some of the places that Jude was talking about, is so lots of information on your voter registration form becomes public record, and this is important to let people know about this, especially for folks that are have safety concerns. There is a confidential voting program that we will, but you can't do it in this form. So we'll give you that information of how to do that. But I just really want to call that out and make sure that people have that awareness, right? So that's that trauma informed. They have full information, they know what to expect, and they can then make a choice that is best for them. When it comes to that mailing address, check in with the agency and the program that you're working with. I think it's likely that a lot of those shelters probably won't be allowed to be used as a mailing address unless they have a program such as the Community Service Office at Compass, that 77 South Washington Street. I would be curious to crowdsource if anybody else knows of other types of programs that we can be highlighting across King County, but there is also general delivery. And so it's usually one location in a jurisdiction, but it is another place, and you do have to contact the post office and set that up. So it does take a little bit of work, but that is another option. But as Jude said, I can be living at a shelter in Burien and getting my mail at my sister's in Kirkland as well. So, and then the other thing I just want to highlight, and Jude went into this a little bit, but that signature is key, right? And so for folks that are already registered and haven't updated their signature in a while, this might be a good conversation to have with folks. Our signature changes over time, and certainly if we have whether through age or medical condition where our fine motor skills are less or different than they were when we were younger, that can change a signature as well. So the address confidentiality, these are the things that become part of the public record. So we really want folks to be contacting the Secretary of State's office. The coalition has a nice little half sheet that we always keep with our voter registration information when we're out in the community. Part of the post-survey training that I'm going to ask y'all to complete is how we can help you and what materials you might need. So just know that this is an option for folks, and we want to make sure they know about it. So Jude, I'll let you talk about alternate forms of ID.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, for folks that don't have a Washington State ID or license, and maybe don't know the last digits of their social security number, what they're, and you, if you have them fill out the form, send that in. The elections office is going to review it. They're going to see that the ID is missing, and then they are going to send a letter to the mailing address, and then they are also going to reach out via phone or email, whatever has been provided to them, about getting in another form of ID. Essentially, any government document that shows your name and address qualifies as a form of ID that can be used to register to vote. But some other common forms that folks have are tribal ID, passport or military ID. You can use a utility bill, a bank statement, a government check, or a current paycheck. They really try to be flexible. So for some, they might request that you come in person and show that ID. But for most forms of ID, they'll even be okay if you can take a picture of it and email it to them. They can add that to your registration information and make sure that you are registered to vote. But again, making sure to provide a valid ID is going to be really important to make your ballot count. I actually learned recently that if you do submit your registration, you don't have the ID, they will still send you a provisional ballot. So this is a little bit different. Provisional ballots are set aside until they can be verified in terms of, getting that registration verified, and then they're counted. So folks might get their ID, and then they might be really excited, or they might get their ballot, might be really excited, might fill it out, and then might have missed the letter that says, hey, you need to submit ID before we even open your ballot. So that's going to be something important to keep in mind. Often I'll ask people to set reminders. I'll suggest that they make a plan. I will see if sometimes someone just like didn't want to pull out their ID in the moment. And so I'll like kind of be like, well, you got to take the extra step, and try to really encourage them to dig deep and remember that information. But definitely something important to keep in mind. Next slide. And then lastly, we just had some additional tips when it comes to voter registration. My biggest tip for all of y'all is that, especially if you're in King County, elections is very on top of answering questions, providing voter support over the phone. They even have interpretation available in over 125 languages. So you can call them using that number, 206-296-8683. Also, if you just Google King County elections, that phone number will pop right up. I know that I call them and bug them with questions all the time. And they are very patient. They will help explain things clearly. You can call again 5 seconds later and ask for clarification. But that might be something that if you're talking to someone, they really want to vote and you can't figure out how to help them make it happen, you can just hop on the phone with King County elections with that person, or be able to share that phone number with them, and they'll provide the expert support. And then just some other tips when you're helping someone fill out a voter registration form. You want it to be legible. That's probably the biggest downfall. If they send something to the wrong address, or they can't verify your name, or can't read the date of birth, that could be an issue. And so you are welcome to help someone complete the form. Like, you can physically fill out all of the fields, but they have to sign the declaration at the bottom. Next slide. So these are some of our key dates to keep in mind. So voter pamphlets and ballots are going out today and tomorrow. You should start seeing them in your mailbox if you're already registered to vote over the weekend, and at the latest on Monday. The election day is August 2nd. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you can only register people to vote online or by mail until July 25th. But they can go in even on the day of election. They can go in 7:30, August 2nd to the King County Elections Office in Renton, register to vote, get a ballot, fill it out, hand it back to them in 30 minutes, and be good to go. And then that kind of pattern is followed for the general election as well. But with that period starting October 18th and running until November 8th. So I always like to, if you have a moment, take a screenshot, take a picture, put these dates down in your calendar, make them your phone background. It can be very helpful because I know it's easy to procrastinate. And then on July 30th, be like, oh my gosh, I still haven't voted yet after I told 20 people to vote. And then just some other helpful good practices. If someone has moved, if they have changed their name, if they don't have like a regular signature that they feel confident being able to write again, they can always update your voter registration. So for folks who are already registered, the easiest way sometimes is to go online. You can change your name and address. You can also do this over the phone. And then if you fill out a voter registration form, you can just fill it out completely once more and they'll update that information. You could just put your name, birthday, and then sign it and they'll update your signature. So it's helpful to stay up to date and on top of it. It's also just a good habit for folks to build. For those of you that might be out collecting voter registration forms, we recommend making sure to turn forms in within 5 days of receiving them, especially when you're in an election season. Be particularly mindful that if they gave you a voter registration form so that they could vote in the primary, you need to return that 8 days before election day, and make sure that that is done in a timely manner. I think that also goes back to Allison's comment earlier about how folks will often have some trauma from asking for help from organizations and then not receiving it, right? So we want to be models of making sure that folks know, I'm going to turn this in tomorrow for you, or you can turn it in yourself if you feel more confident. But just being on top of it is going to be really key. And then the last thing is, how do you know that you have successfully registered to vote? Sometimes it feels like you turn the form in and then you're like, okay, now what happened? I tell folks to look out for a voter ID card arriving at their mailing address. That's going to confirm that they are receiving their election information in their ballot at the correct address. And then it's also helpful to have on hand because it's another form of accepted government ID. While you don't need to bring your card to vote, it'll still have information on your voting districts. And usually they include some tidbits on how to change your language preferences, what dates to turn in your ballots by. So they need to make sure that they receive a voter ID card. If they don't receive one at their mailing address, that means their ballot isn't going to go to the mailing address. And so the best thing you can do is contact the elections office again. They can look up your information and let you know what the status of that is. And at any time, you can view your personal voter information, you can view your ballot, you can view the voters pamphlet at votewa.gov. So that's another awesome resource to highlight. And if you need voter registration supplies, King County Elections, I know, is awesome. You can call them, ask for flyers on pre-registration, on voting if someone has a felony conviction. You can get voter registration forms in multiple languages and other forms of outreach or posters in various languages. They're a great resource for that. And the Secretary of State, you can also request paper forms by mail, and they will just send you a big pack of however many forms you want to be able to go out there and get people registered to vote.
Awesome. So clearly I need to tighten up my time management skills because we're running up against the clock here, but Jude and I are both very excited about this information. So I threw back into the chat the post survey. Really, honestly, this is a way for us to understand how we can really help you do this work. It is not to be burdensome. So please fill that out. Let us know how we can help you. And then maybe in the chat, just to start to close us out. Let us know how you think you're going to use this information, how you think you're going to help register to vote, and then start getting to think about how we can incorporate this into your programs, because that is a huge part of what we want to do. The other thing I want to mention, and I think this goes back to a question earlier in at the beginning of, people asking like, well, I don't know who to vote for, or I don't know, I don't feel like I have enough information to vote. And I think that's a real feeling that a lot of folks have, just across the board, right? Like not just people experiencing homelessness. So going back to that nonpartisan voter registration work, right? So we can, as Jude clearly said, we can help people fill out that registration form, like physically write it out for them. We can physically help them like fill out their ballot, but they have to sign it. We can't tell people who to vote for. We can't, wear paraphernalia or, logos of, candidates that we want, that we support or we think are good. We can't say, well, so-and-so is really progressive on homeless and housing issues. We can't do any of that, right? We can say, here's the Secretary of State's office. Here's the candidates' web pages. Here's the voter pamphlet to get more information like that. But that's a little bit of the, we didn't include that slide and I realized that was a miss. So we'll add it to the lessons learned for this one. But I'm going to stop sharing at this point. And we are over, so I understand if people have to go, but I just want to see, does anybody else have any other questions? Anything that didn't come away with clarity or need a little more information?
I know earlier someone mentioned that folks will often say that they don't feel like they have enough information to vote. Another thing that I will do when folks bring that up to me is I'll recommend, and again, I'm a nonpartisan worker, so I'm not going to say like, go check out this person, go check out this person, but I'll suggest, hey, you're going to get a voter pamphlet in the mail with your ballot. You can review that. If it's a lot to read, you can check out some organizations and see if they've done candidate forums or questionnaires. Just plugging, the Urban League has a candidate questionnaire if you want to learn about some of our candidates' interests and responses to the questions that our community had for them. I'll also recommend checking the news, looking at third-party scorecards, and even just hearing directly from the candidates themselves, checking out their social media or their website and learning about their platform. You can honestly learn a lot from nonpartisan sources, from those voter pamphlets, and from candidates directly.
Well, folks, thanks for hanging with us for these last 3 minutes. I really encourage you to fill out that post-survey form for us, because in addition to some of these just really, nuts and bolts registration forms, if you don't have the ability to print that off, we can help with that. But the coalition has a lot of information that's really specific to, you don't need a home to be a voter, or you don't need an address to be a voter. That has a lot of great information. I know Jude has a lot of great information that I've seen and stolen some stuff from, and we want to get that information out to you. And then again, that beautiful artwork from the Washington Rights Restoration, Voting Rights Restoration Coalition. So have a lovely day. Enjoy the sunshine, because I think it's hot as heck in my office right now. So hopefully that means it's still beautiful and lovely out and you can go get a little vitamin D. I'll throw my email into the chat. And then the other thing I'll just mention, and we haven't, yeah, typing and talking just does not work for me. We haven't promoted this yet, but the coalition is going to be doing a new voter registration volunteer event in the fall. So if you or folks that want to do this work out in the community, email me, because we're gonna get a crew up and running. And on that note, have a lovely day. We're gonna